The Galactic Council sat in their chamber, a great hall filled with voices that had grown tired. The chamber was round, with high walls of glass that showed the dark stars outside. Once it was a place of power, where leaders of many races gathered with pride. Now it was filled with fear. Reports kept arriving from the colonies, each one darker than the last. The Drail had come again, and nothing seemed able to stop them. The Drail were a cruel species. They moved across the galaxy like fire, burning everything in their path. Their ships were sharp and cold, built only for war. They did not talk, they did not make peace, and they did not stop. Wherever they arrived, they took control of the world and left ruins behind. Whole cities were turned into cages for the living. Planets that once had green fields now lay in smoke. The Council had sent armies, fleets, and promises, but every attempt failed. The Drail crushed them all. Admiral Selvek of the Terran Confederacy stood at the center of the chamber. His face was gray, his eyes full of weight. He spoke slowly, as though each word was heavy. He said that the outer colonies had fallen. Not one or two, but many. The Drail now pushed closer toward the core systems. There were no reinforcements left to send. There were no fleets strong enough to face them. The galaxy's defenders were breaking apart. The Council members argued, but their arguments were hollow. Some asked for new plans, others asked for help from neighbors who were too weak themselves. A few shouted that surrender was better than extinction. The noise filled the chamber, but there was no strength in it. Everyone already knew the truth. They were finished. The Drail would win. Whispers spread in the shadows of the chamber. The people outside the hall were already losing faith. Refugees arrived from broken worlds with eyes empty of hope. Children cried for homes they would never see again. Traitors carried nothing but sad news. Every whisper told the same story. There was no one left to fight. In a quiet corner of the chamber, someone spoke of humanity. At first it was only a murmur. A few remembered humans, though most had long forgotten. They said humanity was reckless and wild, always fighting, never bending. Long ago they had vanished into silence. Some said they had destroyed themselves in war. Others said they had fled into the dark between stars. No one had seen them for centuries, and no one believed they could still live. Humanity was a story, not a fact. But still, the name carried weight. Some council members looked uneasy when the word was spoken. Humans had once been underestimated, yet they had fought battles that no one else would dare. Records showed that they refused surrender, even when outnumbered. They were a people who turned despair into fury. They were not kind, but they were strong. And now, when the galaxy needed strength most, they were gone. Admiral Selvek lowered his head. He said aloud what many feared to say. The defenders were finished. The Drail could not be stopped. Humanity was a ghost of the past. There was no one left who could fight back. The council chamber fell into silence. Outside the windows, the stars shone cold and far away. Each leader thought of their people, their worlds, their homes. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of defeat. Hope was gone. The galaxy was on its knees, and the Drail were closing in. On a refugee world far from the council's chamber, life was hard and quiet. The planet was not rich or strong. It was only a safe place for people who had fled from the Drail. Camps were built in long rows of metal shelters. Smoke from cooking fires drifted in the air. Food was short, and the sky was always filled with the sound of new ships landing with more broken families. People walked slowly, carrying nothing but what little they had saved. Children clung to their parents. Old men and women sat with empty eyes. It was a place filled with sadness. Laura Bennett worked there as a translator. She was young but tired, her face thin from long days. She spoke many languages, and that made her useful. Refugees came from all parts of the galaxy, and Laura helped them speak to one another. She heard every story, every cry, every memory of worlds that were gone. Sometimes at night she sat outside her shelter, listening to the voices around her. All she heard was fear. One day, while she was helping a group of traders, she overheard something different. The traders spoke in whispers, careful not to be heard. They said they had seen something strange on their way through the outer routes. They had seen ships in the dark, ships larger than any they had known. The ships did not attack, but they moved in silence between the stars. They carried no flags of the council, no marks of the Drail. The traders swore they looked human. Laura felt her heart jump. She asked them again, but they only shook their heads. They said it was madness. Humanity was gone, destroyed long ago. They laughed at their own story. saying perhaps the dark and fear had played tricks on their eyes. Still, Laura remembered their words. That night she could not sleep. She kept hearing the phrase in her head, "Ships in the dark." The next day she told Captain Daniel Carter. He was an older man, strong but quiet, with eyes that had seen too much. Daniel had once been a pilot before the Drail destroyed his fleet. Now he worked to keep order in the refugee camp. He was respected because he did not give up, even when others did. When Laura told him about the ships, he did not laugh. Instead, he grew serious. Daniel had studied the old archives of Earth in his free time. Most people ignored them, but he believed there was something in those records worth remembering. He told Laura that long ago humanity had built great fleets. They had fought wars no one else dared to fight. They had built weapons and ships that shocked even their enemies, but then one day they vanished. No one knew why. Some said they had turned on each other. Others said they had hidden themselves far away. Laura asked him if he believed the traitor's story. Daniel did not answer at once. He looked at the night sky above the camp. The stars were countless, cold and silent. Finally, he said he believed humanity was not as weak as the Council had thought. If they had survived, perhaps they were waiting. He said the Drail might not be the only shadow watching the galaxy. Word spread slowly in the camp. Laura and Daniel told only a few, but stories have a way of growing. Refugees began to whisper of humans in the void, humans who might one day return. Some laughed at the idea. Others held on to it like a fire in the dark. The children asked about humans with wide eyes, wanting to hear the tales again and again. The old spoke of times when humans fought battles no one else dared. The idea of them brought a strange kind of comfort. Still, the world outside the camp grew worse. More ships arrived with bad news. The Drail had taken more systems. The Council was begging for help but receiving none. Allies betrayed one another, surrendering to save themselves. Whole fleets disappeared in single battles. People began to say the galaxy was ending. Even the bravest leaders had no answers left. Laura felt the weight of despair pressing harder each day. Yet each time she thought of the traitor's words, she felt a spark. She remembered their frightened faces when they spoke of the ships. She remembered how Daniel's eyes had sharpened at the mention of humanity. It was not proof, but it was something to hold on to. Daniel began to collect what little he could about humans. Old stories, broken files, half-burned records. He shared them with Laura, and together they pieced together small truths. They read about battles where human fleets stood against stronger foes. They read about soldiers who refused to kneel. They read about a people who were stubborn, reckless, and brave. Laura listened to every word. She began to believe the traitors had not lied. In the camp, she started telling the children about humans. She told them humans did not surrender even when surrounded. She told them humans could build ships from nothing. She told them humans were wild and strong and that they had once frightened the galaxy. The children laughed and clapped, their eyes brighter than before. The parents listened quietly, pretending not to care, but their faces softened. Daniel warned her to be careful. Hope could be dangerous, he said. If the humans were truly gone, then people would only be more broken when they found out. But Laura said hope was the only thing they had left. Even if it was a story, it kept people alive. One night, Laura and Daniel stood outside the camp together. The stars were silent above them. Daniel spoke in a low voice. He said that if the humans still lived, they would not stay silent forever. He said they would return when the galaxy needed them most. Laura asked if he truly believed that. He did not smile, but he said yes. He had to believe it. Without belief, there was nothing. The camp grew darker in the weeks that followed, but the whispers grew too. People spoke of ships in the void. They spoke of warriors who might return. No one knew if it was true. But when the night was long and the sky was filled with fear, the story of humanity gave them a reason to breathe. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, Laura thought she could almost see shadows moving between the stars. The Drail did not stop. Their fleets moved deeper into the heart of the galaxy, one system after another. Worlds that had once been safe now fell in silence. Great cities turned dark, their lights fading as the Drail ships settled into orbit. People who had once lived with pride and comfort were chained and carried away. The galaxy was bleeding and no one could stop it. In the Council's chamber, fear grew louder. Leaders shouted at one another, but their words had no power. Promises were made and then broken the next day. Some worlds withdrew their fleets to protect themselves, leaving their neighbors to die. Others signed secret deals with the Drail, hoping to survive by surrender. Every alliance was weak. Trust was gone. The council begged for unity, but no one listened anymore. Chancellor Vaynar stood in the center, his voice shaking. He said they must keep fighting, but even he knew his words were empty. Reports showed that more than half the defending fleets had been destroyed. The Drail were not slowing down. They were building new strongholds on captured planets. Soon they would strike the last bastion of the Council. Everyone knew what that meant. Once the core fell, the galaxy would be theirs. On the refugee world, Laura Bennett listened as more survivors arrived. They came with hollow faces and broken voices. Some had lost families. Some had lost entire cities. They spoke of battles where whole fleets vanished in hours. They spoke of council generals who begged for mercy and found none. Each story pressed harder on her heart, but she did not look away. She listened because she knew the people needed someone who would. Captain Daniel Carter watched the camp with tired eyes. He tried to keep order, but even the strongest men could not calm the growing despair. Fights broke out over food. People whispered that they should leave the planet, but there was nowhere safe to go. At night, Daniel walked between the shelters, hearing the same words again and again. It is over. But still, Laura and Daniel spoke of the rumors. They remembered the traitors' story of the ships in the dark. They remembered the old records of human fleets. At first they had told only each other. Now, when the night was quiet, small groups gathered around Laura to hear. She spoke in a soft voice, telling them about battles where humans had stood against impossible odds. She told them about soldiers who fought even when hope was gone. She told them that humans never surrendered. The people listened. Some cried. Some shook their heads, but many felt a warmth inside, a small flame in the dark. They asked her to tell more. They asked if she truly believed the humans might return. Laura said she believed. She had no proof, but she believed. Daniel listened too, his arms crossed, his face calm, but his eyes showed the same fire. Outside the camp, the Drail kept advancing. Whole fleets of them filled the skies of captured worlds. They had no mercy, no weakness. Their technology seemed endless, their numbers without limit. Each day the Council received more messages, begging for help, and each day fewer answers came. The galaxy's great defenders were gone, and those who remained were broken. Chancellor Vaynar sent a desperate plea to all who could hear. He begged for anyone to rise, for anyone to fight. His words carried across the stars, but they sounded like the cries of a drowning man. No one answered. No one could. In the council chamber, the silence after his call was worse than the sound of war. In the refugee camp, people gathered around Daniel and Laura again. A man asked why humans would return after so long. Why would they care for a council that had abandoned them in the past? Daniel answered slowly. He said that if the humans were still alive, they might not return for the council. They would return because the Drail were a threat too great to ignore. He said humans did not always fight for allies, but they always fought against enemies who threatened them. If they lived, the Drail would not be allowed to stand. The people listened. They whispered to each other. Some began to hope again, though they did not want to admit it. Hope was dangerous, but it made them stronger. Laura saw it in their eyes. For the first time in months, the refugees stood a little taller, but outside the darkness grew closer. Reports came that the Drail were preparing to strike the Council's final fortress. This fortress was the last defense of the core. If it fell, nothing would remain. Soldiers in the fortress sent messages filled with fear. They begged for reinforcements, but none were left. Everyone knew the end was near. Laura sat with Daniel one evening, looking at the stars. She asked him what he thought would happen if the humans truly returned. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said he believed the galaxy would change forever. He said humans did not return quietly. If they came back, they would come with fire. Laura felt both fear and hope in his words. She wondered what kind of people the humans had become after all these years. Were they the same reckless fighters from the old stories? Or had they grown even stronger in the shadows? She did not know, but she wanted to believe they still carried the same spirit. The Drail closed in on the last fortress. The Council prepared for surrender. Refugees prayed for miracles. And somewhere hidden in the endless dark, the truth waited. The galaxy did not know it yet, but hope was not gone. It was only waiting to wake. The last fortress of the Council stood like a lonely flame in the dark. It was a great station built in orbit around a blue world, its walls filled with weapons and shields. Thousands of soldiers waited inside, but their faces were pale with fear. They knew the Drail were coming. Their fleets filled the edge of the system like a black storm. The soldiers checked their weapons again and again, but none believed they could win. Messages poured into the fortress. Some were from leaders begging them to hold out a little longer. Some were from families saying goodbye. And some were from commanders who admitted they had no more fleets to send. The fortress was alone. Inside the command chamber, Chancellor Vaynar stood with shaking hands. He listened to the reports of enemy movements, his eyes full of despair. Generals spoke, but their words had no fire. They said the Drail would arrive in hours. They said the fortress could hold for a short time, but not forever. Vaynar lowered his head. For the first time, he thought the galaxy might truly be finished. On the refugee world, Laura Bennett and Captain Daniel Carter also heard the news. People in the camp cried openly. Some fell to their knees, praying for safety that would never come. Others sat in silence, broken beyond words. The children clung to their parents, asking what would happen now. No one had an answer. That night, Laura sat outside her shelter, looking at the sky. The stars seemed so far away, cold and endless. She thought of the traitor's story again, of the ships in the dark. She thought of the humans who had once fought with fury. She wanted to believe they would return, but the silence of the stars gave her no comfort. Daniel sat beside her. He said nothing, but his presence kept her from falling apart. Then, as the Drail fleet entered the system of the fortress, the stars changed. At first, it was only a small ripple on the scanners. The Drail ships paused, confused. A second ripple followed, then a third. Space itself seemed to tremble. The soldiers in the fortress stared at their screens, unable to understand what they were seeing. The Drail moved closer, their dark ships spreading like blades, but then the void erupted. From hyperspace came massive shapes, black and silver against the stars. One after another they emerged, hundreds, then thousands. Their hulls were sharp and strong, their weapons bristling with light. They moved in perfect lines, disciplined and terrifying. At their center flew the largest ship of all, a giant that cast shadows across the battlefield. On its side was a symbol no one had seen in centuries. It was the banner of humanity. The fortress shook with cries. Soldiers who had been ready to die now shouted in disbelief. The Drail hesitated for the first time. Their formations broke as they scrambled to understand this new arrival. And then a voice carried across the channels, cold and steady. It was Admiral Jonathan Pierce of the human fleet. He spoke with no kindness. He said humanity had watched from the void. He said they had seen the Drail burn worlds and enslave the weak. He said the time for silence was over. Humanity had returned not for the council, but for war. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled every heart with fire. The human fleet moved with precision. Waves of fighters launched from their carriers. Heavy cruisers opened fire, their cannons tearing through Drail ships with brutal force. The void filled with light as human weapons struck. The Drail, so strong against others, now fell back. Their ships broke under the fury of the human armada. In the fortress, the soldiers watched in awe. They saw Drail ships shatter one after another. They saw humans fight with a discipline no one else had shown. Every move was sharp, every strike exact. The Drail had no answer. For the first time in living memory, the enemy was retreating. On the refugee world, the news reached the camp. People gathered around the transmitters, listening to the reports. They heard the voices of soldiers crying with joy. They heard the word humanity spoken again and again. Laura covered her mouth with her hands, tears in her eyes. Daniel stood tall, his face hard but his eyes burning bright. The humans had come back. The stories were true. The battle raged for hours, but the result was clear. The Drail had been caught unprepared, and their pride turned to panic. Their great fleet, once feared, broke apart as they fled into the dark. The human ships chased them, striking without mercy. One by one, the enemy vanished into nothing. And when the last Drail ship was gone, Admiral Pierce's voice returned. He did not speak of peace. He did not speak of forgiveness. He said only that humanity had returned and that the Drail would fall. Then the channel closed and the human fleet vanished back into the void, leaving behind silence and awe. In the fortress, the soldiers wept. Some fell to their knees. They had been ready to die, but instead they had lived to see hope return. On the refugee world, people cheered for the first time in years. Children shouted the word humans, running through the camp with smiles. Parents hugged their children, their faces no longer empty. Laura looked at Daniel and whispered that the galaxy would never be the same. Daniel nodded. He said the humans had come back with fire and nothing could stop them now. The council was shaken. They had thought humanity gone forever. Now they saw them return not as broken survivors, but as a war armada stronger than anything the galaxy had ever seen. The Drail had finally found an enemy they could not crush. And in the shadows of the void, humanity's war fleet prepared for the battles yet to come. After the battle at the last fortress, the galaxy felt a new energy. Word spread quickly that humans had returned. Survivors whispered stories about the human war armada, about ships moving through the void like shadows, striking with power and precision. People who had lost everything now looked to the stars with hope in their hearts. Captain Daniel Carter and Laura Bennett remained on the refugee world. They moved among the people, helping them rebuild shelters and tend to the injured. The camp was filled with chatter, laughter, and for the first time in many years, the sound of hope. Children played games in the open fields, running freely without fear. Adults shared stories of survival and whispered about the humans who had saved them. Laura often told the children about the battles she had heard about soldiers who did not surrender, and about Admiral Jonathan Pierce, whose name had become a symbol of strength. Daniel worked to organize the survivors, training them in basic defense. He knew the Drail were not gone forever, only defeated for now. The humans had returned to fight, but the rest of the galaxy needed to learn how to survive on its own. Daniel taught lessons in strategy, marking the old maps and showing safe routes through the stars. He emphasized courage and planning, remembering how the humans had fought with precision and discipline. Slowly, the people of the refugee world gained confidence. They felt capable, and the fear that had filled their hearts began to fade. Meanwhile, the human fleet continued its patrols. Admiral Pierce had sent messages across the galaxy, letting civilizations know that humanity had returned. His message was simple: humanity would not be silent again. The Drail would be challenged wherever they appeared. Some species welcomed the news with joy, others with suspicion. The council was both relieved and nervous. They had underestimated humanity for centuries, and now they were learning that humans had their own way of dealing with threats. The council had expected saviors to be gentle, but humans had arrived with fire and strength. Back on the refugee world, Laura watched the night sky with Daniel. Ships from the human fleet occasionally passed over, their lights bright and steady. She could see the formation of smaller ships, patrols that moved with grace and power. Daniel said the humans were not just fighting, they were sending a message. The galaxy needed to remember that strength and courage were not gone. The Drail would think twice before returning, and the people would know they were not alone. Life slowly returned to some normalcy, but the memory of fear lingered. People shared tales of what had been lost, of family, friends, and entire cities. But they also spoke of survival and the courage to continue. Stories of the human fleet inspired them. Children who once hid in fear now dreamed of becoming pilots, engineers, or warriors. Adults who had given up now looked to rebuild their societies. The spark of humanity had reignited the galaxy's spirit. The Drail, however, were not defeated completely. They retreated into the outer edges of the galaxy, licking their wounds and planning their return. Their fleets were shattered, but their hatred remained. Reports came in that they were regrouping, building new ships and gathering forces for another attack. The human fleet knew this and prepared quietly, moving between stars, striking first where the enemy least expected. Their presence alone was enough to slow the Drail's advance. They had become a warning, a living shadow in the galaxy. Within the council, discussions shifted. They realized they had misjudged humanity. The humans were not just warriors, they were survivors, strategists, and guardians. The council began to cooperate with the humans, sharing intelligence and coordinating defenses. Though humans did not fight for the council, they understood the importance of balance and strength in the galaxy. Slowly, the council began to regain some authority, not because of their own power, but because of the humans' intervention. On the refugee world, celebrations were held. Laura and Daniel watched as people danced and sang for the first time in years. Children laughed and played under the stars. The adults shared meals and stories, their faces bright with hope. Laura felt tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and joy. She knew the galaxy had been given a second chance. Daniel stood beside her, looking at the stars with determination. He knew challenges would come again, but he also knew that humans had returned. With them, hope had returned as well. As months passed, the human fleet continued its quiet patrols. Admiral Pierce had no intention of leaving the galaxy unprotected. The Drill remained a threat, but humanity's return had changed the balance of power. The galaxy learned that courage, strength, and unity were not lost. They remembered the stories of old, and they watched the stars with new eyes. Laura and Daniel continued to teach, to help, and to inspire. Their refugee world grew stronger, becoming a hub of hope and learning. People from nearby systems arrived, seeking guidance and protection. The humans had returned not just as warriors, but as symbols. They had shown that even when hope seemed gone, it could awaken from the void. The galaxy was alive again, ready to face the challenges to come. In the quiet of the night, Laura looked at the distant glow of a human ship moving through the stars. She whispered that hope was alive. Daniel nodded, his eyes reflecting the lights. They knew the battles would continue, but the spirit of humanity had returned. It was a force that would never be silenced. And for the first time in generations, the galaxy believed that victory, survival, and freedom were possible once more.